Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about federal finances, the economy, size of government and inflation, wide-ranging economic topics. And to do that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Jerome Gessaroli, Professor of Finance at the British Columbia Institute of Technology and a visiting fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Jerome, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me on your show, Aaron.
Now, Jerome, I thought it might be good to start by talking about the size of the federal government overall. A lot of people are probably aware of the trend of big spending during the COVID-19 pandemic, but maybe you could sort of talk about the overall trend, even before the pandemic, when it comes to size of government and government spending.
Yeah, well, the trend overall for government spending has definitely been to increase year over year, with some minor blips in the interim. And when we talk about government spending, I kind of like to think not just the federal government, but for provincial governments, because cumulatively they add a significant amount of spending and accumulated debts to Canadians also. So the trend has definitely been increasing, and then obviously in the last couple of years, primarily because of the pandemic, the debt load has exploded.
Now, of course, the Trudeau government, they've been in office since 2015. That's 7 years. Every single one of those budgets has been a deficit. I think people might understand that there was going to be a deficit during the pandemic, but what's the explanation for why they have run deficits essentially every year since coming to power?
Well, that's a good question. And the best way I would answer it, Aaron, is that I don't believe that the current government sees deficits as a problem, as an issue. I see they believe there's an opportunity to spend more on different type of social programs and what their priorities are, and they just don't see that there could be a problem going forward in being able to cover the interest costs if interest rates rise, or even if there's needs for spending in other areas in the future. Say there's another pandemic that's just as bad. Will we have the financial flexibility to cover the costs that we'll have to incur at that time?
Well, and so you've answered the question, which I think is a legitimate answer, is that they simply don't think it's important to balance budgets. But I guess I'd put to you then, why is it in fact important to balance budgets? A lot of people argue it's sort of an arbitrary goal. It's a very abstract idea for a lot of Canadians. So why should governments endeavor to balance budgets?
Yeah, well, that's right. And first of all, let me say that not all government deficit spending is a bad thing. Okay, there could be some good investments that the government makes in building infrastructure, building roads, highways, schools, hospitals, things like that. That improves Canada and that builds capacity. But when we borrow for items that are not effective in growing the economy, well, then we're just taking a burden on ourselves. And we will have to pay the money back, not just the principal, but the interest on top of it. And as you know, interest rates vary over time, and interest rates are rising. So the government has borrowed in the last few years based on very, very low interest rates, almost close to zero. And now they're facing where they have to refinance some of their debt, and the new debt that they're taking on, they have to finance it at higher rates. And that's going to be a burden for the government. And when I mean a burden for the government, I mean a burden for all of us, the taxpayers. And the other thing with government spending is that we want to maintain what we call financial flexibility. And that means the ability to borrow more in the future if, as I mentioned earlier, there's a significant emergency, whatever the emergency may be. And we know that there's lots going on in the world that we could see where there may be some significant impact on Canada. So if we borrow too much now, we won't have that financial flexibility to respond in the future.
Okay, these are good points. You're asking governments, Jerome, to plan long term, which is not a good thing, not something a lot of governments are good at. But an interesting point, and I want to pick up this topic of deficits after the break. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking government deficits, spending in the economy with Jerome Gessaroli, Professor of Finance at the BC Institute of Technology and a visiting fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Jerome, we were just talking about the change in interest rates. I wanted to contrast the Liberal government of today and the deficits they're running with the Liberal government of the early 1990s, when we had John Chrétien as Prime Minister and Paul Martin as Finance Minister. They took a very different approach to government spending. And I'm wondering if you could sort of, what are your thoughts on what's different today from then? And do you see this Liberal government being able to do what that Liberal government did and get the budget back to balance?
Yeah, what in the mid '90s, under the Chrétien government, and when Paul Martin was finance minister, Canada actually was facing a real debt problem. We were approaching the limit of the amount of debt that we could support and the interest costs. So, quite frankly, the government had to do something. And to their credit, they did. They made some hard choices, and they cut back on spending, and they brought the deficit down. And that was continued under successive governments, including the Conservative government later on. And that was done under the realization that there was a limit that we could borrow, and we were approaching it. Now, due to that hard work, we've got some financial flexibility to borrow more, and the Liberal government right now is taking advantage of that and borrowing more. There's a couple interesting telling points. The Prime Minister once said, Trudeau said, that the budgets will balance themselves. That's a little bit of an astonishing comment. The budgets won't balance themselves. It takes some fiscal discipline and some hard decisions to balance budgets. Chrystia Freeland, in the budget speech for 2021 as finance minister, she said interest rates are at very low levels, and so we should take advantage of that and borrow more. Well, I understand the logic behind that, but you have to be very careful when you're borrowing more at low interest rates, because low interest rates don't stay low forever. Interest rates are market driven. So if we load up the back of the truck with debt, and when rates are low, we can handle that. But then when rates increase later on, we could find ourselves in a very difficult position.
That's a very good point. I wanted to just do an Econ 101 moment, because I know this is a terminology issue that a lot of people don't make the distinction on. The difference between deficits and debt. I think a lot of people use those terms interchangeably. So maybe you could sort of explain, what is the difference between deficits and debt?
Sure. Well, when we say that a government is running a deficit, we say that it's spending more than it's bringing in tax revenue, say over a period of the year. So, for instance, the government of Ontario is running a deficit of roughly $13 billion for the year. But when we talk about debts and government debts, we refer to everything that the government owes, not just what they borrowed in the most recent year, but whatever they borrowed in the past that hasn't yet been repaid. So in that way, the debt is a cumulative figure. And again, looking at the Ontario example, I believe that the debt in Ontario is the total debt is about $400 billion. And that's quite large. The debt per capita, per person in Canada, has increased. In 2010, it was about $16,000 per person, the overall debt. 2020, it's at $28,000 per person. So we can see the relative rapid increase in the amount of overall government debt.
Some people don't like the analogy of the credit card, but do you think it's a reasonable analogy that a deficit is when you put more on your card than you pay off in 1 month, but the debt is the balance that you carry on the card over time that you're paying interest on every month?
Well, in general, conceptually, I think that that's a reasonable way to look at it. I mean, there are some fundamental differences between government borrowing and individuals borrowing. Governments have the ability to tax, okay, and it's theoretically an unlimited ability. So that is a major difference between looking at individuals and the government when it comes to borrowing. But having said that, the government will face similar type limits, and the reason why it's limited as individuals do on how much we can borrow.
Okay, great comments from Jerome Gessaroli. Well, we're going to take a short break. Jerome, I wanted to get your thoughts on the fact that this year's federal budget, obviously still a fairly large deficit, but perhaps a little smaller than expected, and certainly smaller than last year when we were sort of in the thick of temporary COVID spending. But a recent analysis by the Parliamentary Budget Officer suggested that a large chunk of spending is actually not related to COVID. So I wanted to get your thoughts on whether you think that government has actually permanently expanded in size, and that the sort of what was viewed or framed as a temporary increase in spending is actually going to be a permanent increase in government spending.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to be careful of, and obviously the federal government would like to make this connection, is the large reduction in the deficit from the previous year to the most recent fiscal year. And while that's true, that's not a very good prudent comparison, because, as you mentioned, the huge amount of spending required due to the pandemic, and a lot of it was required, not all of it, but a lot of it was required. That was not the norm. So we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to how big the deficit was just a year ago. So we're still talking, I think, about roughly $57 billion in the deficit for the fiscal year. Historically, that's quite a large number. And as you mentioned, the programs that the government is prioritizing, these are programs that will carry on in the future. So they're not a one-off. They're things that will reoccur. So whether it's the national daycare program, or whether it's the national dental program, these are programs that we're going to have to budget for in the future. And quite frankly, they're noble programs, but can we afford them the way they're designed? And is there a better way to accomplish the same objective?
Now, you mentioned earlier on that one of the incentives for governments to borrow was that interest rates were quite low, and so it was, in other words, cheap to borrow. I think we've seen this in the private sector as well. What do you see as the impact of rising interest rates on the government's ability to finance its programs, to finance its debt, and frankly, its ambitions for the things that it wants government to do?
Yeah, well, no doubt it's going to make it more difficult for the government to borrow more when interest rates are rising. There's we have a manageable amount but significant amount of debt we've taken on, and quite frankly, we're going to have to shift sooner or later. Okay, I don't know how late it might be, but sooner or later there will become a point where the government's going to have to say, well, are we going to be increasing taxes even more to cover the higher borrowing costs, or do we look at what programs, make some hard decisions on what programs we're going to have to cut back and or eliminate? The other thing is that government spending, it tends to be incremental. It's always, okay, we've spent X amount last year, so we need to spend X plus a few more percent this year on the same program. And I think rather what could be done quite effectively is to look at, okay, we spent on programs A, B, and C in the past year. Do we still need those programs in their current form going forward? Rather than let's just add on another 2, 3, 4% to them. And I believe that that we can make some headway in reducing spending, reducing borrowing without actually sacrificing much in the way of services that the government provides.
Well, asking if something is working or not seems like a pretty simple request of government. I wanted to touch to one last question before the break on energy prices. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on government revenue. Do you see high energy prices as helping the government in terms of getting it flush with revenues to pay for things?
Well, obviously, Canada relies quite a bit its economy on resources, including energy, and the energy prices will definitely increase government revenues, provincial and federal government revenues. But we can't rely on that as a permanent revenue base because, again, commodity prices that fluctuate internationally, and the big push now to reduce Canada's dependence upon oil and fossil fuels in our economy means that revenue won't be taxation revenue won't be available in the medium long term.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We're going to take a short break. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking federal budget and the economy with Jerome Gessaroli, Professor of Finance at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. Jerome, a big issue obviously this year is inflation. It is at an all-time 30-year high here in Canada. What are your thoughts on how this is impacting the country, the economy, and more importantly, for the purposes of our discussion, the government spending plans and its ability to finance its debt?
Yeah, the inflation is definitely going to throw a wrench in overall plans, and the inflation is going to affect you and I, the average person, fairly significantly. Also, there's a number of different ways, not just making goods and services more expensive, but rather it's going to force the Bank of Canada to be increasing interest rates faster than and higher than they would like. Now, that's going to increase the probability that we're going to have a hard landing. In other words, when inflation starts to come down, the economy will really have slowed and we may well be into a recession. Now, how significant that recession will be, well, no one really knows at this point. But that's one of the consequences of having rapidly rising prices. Another issue is when we have inflation, it's almost a form of taxation. Okay, so we have a lower overall standard of living because we're paying more for the same goods and services than we were in the past, and that's going to affect you and I. So this is very unfortunate. The fact that we have this inflation to the degree we have it is also problematic from the government and the Bank of Canada's perspective. I know that a lot of policy analysts will say, well, it's due to the global supply chain issues and the Russian war and things like that. Well, it's not really due to the Russian war and just high oil prices because we had significant inflation before that even occurred. And the Bank of Canada had signs that inflation was occurring and building before they took action. So they really did take action later than they ought to have. And it's easy to be an armchair quarterback after the fact and say they should have done something earlier. And I understand that. But there were signs out there that inflation was like that. And thirdly, it's not all due to the supply chain issues that are limiting the amount of goods that people can buy, therefore pushing the prices up. The inflation is also occurring due to the high government spending in the past couple of years. And that was shown in a major report that came out not too long ago, that in Canada, I believe we can account for at least 2.5% of the inflation number was due to government stimulus.
Well, definitely. So some government's ability to impact inflation after all and not being able to blame it on global issues. I wanted to ask you one last question on the affordability issue, because of course it's not just governments that have to deal with higher prices. A lot of Canadians are struggling. Obvious examples are the price of housing, the price of gasoline, but just the general price of everything is increasing. And governments are increasingly looking at affordability issues, to help people out. What are some simple measures you think governments could take to address these affordability issues?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. We've got into this situation. It hasn't happened overnight. It's occurred by having very low interest rate policies over the last number of years, by having consistent and chronic deficit spending by provincial and federal governments, and so it's been a cumulative effect, and it will take years to kind of unwind that effect. We need to go along a path of economic growth and productivity. So the government policy needs to shift. They need to shift their priorities to growing the economy and implementing policies, and not necessarily spending, but policies that allow Canada to become more productive, and that will help everyone.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. Jerome Gessaroli is a finance professor at the BC Institute of Technology, talking about some very pressing issues facing Canada today, affordability. I want to thank you, the viewer, for joining us, and we will see you again next time on Our Canada, Our Future.